Good morning. Lovely to be here. Thanks for all of you for showing up, and thanks to Naomi, Colin, and Alex and others who organized the event. It's been fantastic. Really delighted to participate today. We're going to carry forward the tradition started by Viviane and Alex of introducing one another. So to my left is Colin Hastings, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo. I met Colin on a speed date in Toronto. He was shopping for supervisors, and that was in
2013.
13. We met at a cafe. It came down to me and some other dude, and he picked me, which was a very good choice, I think. Shortly. And after I met him, I immediately contacted Mary Louise Adams, with whom he had worked at Queen's University in his master's degree. And she said, oh, yeah, you got to get him. He's like the sweetest straight boy you'll ever meet. And he's the kind of guy you want to work with, because these are the guys we need to support, and he's brilliant. And she was right in all respects. Like, Colin has done amazing work that bridges the sort of gap between critical studies of health and activism. He's taking a leading role on the public health file at the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization. His work is varied, but addresses, critical studies of public health, often in relation to other forms of governance, such as criminal law, and increasingly taking up questions of the privatization of public health, which is a kind of terrain that's not widely explored. He is the author of Digital News and HIV Criminalization, the Social Organization of Convergence Journalism, which is the second book published in the Institutional Ethnography series of the University of Toronto Press, which I edit. And it's a fantastic book. It's been nominated for the John Porter Prize, conferred by the Canadian Sociological Association. And I would encourage all of you to get your copy and read it. It's a lovely, lovely book, brilliant and extremely well written. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. I have the easiest job in terms of introductions because the person to my right needs no introduction. He is a renowned critical sociologist, scholar of critical public health, has been at the very forefront of scholar activism to resist and reform HIV criminalization for decades, and has been a tremendously influential institutional ethnographer for decades, as we're going to hear about in the tape today as well. His talents are not limited to the university. He's also an accomplished stand-up bassist, orchestral stand-up bassist. He's a champion tennis player. And the thing that I appreciate the most is that he is a renowned, highly cited, highly influential scholar who takes supervision very seriously as part of his work, and that is not always the case. He's like an endlessly patient, incredibly supportive supervisor who cares not only about his connection to his students, but his students' connection to one another and to the university and to the various spaces where their work will be meaningful. Like, he does the work to help people understand how they fit within this big milieu, and I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Oh, thanks.
So, Eric, today we have some tape of a younger Eric Mykhalovskiy and George Smith, and maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about what we're going to hear in terms of the context. What was this meeting about? What were you up to? I think we figured this is the summer of 1993, so if you could take us back there.
Yes, and so what we're trying to do, I think, is carry forward the theme, one of the themes of the workshop, which is sort of legacies of work, and so we're sort of trying to think through how George's work has flowed down through the years and taken up by people in different ways, and trying to do that in a way that might bring something of George to the room through practices of remembrance and listening. And so this tape, which are we going to talk a little bit about how I knew George first, or are we going to go right to the tape?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what your relationship with him was like at the time.
Okay.
And then
Okay, so I met George I won't try not to take too long about this, but I met George in 1989 at a job interview I was a secretary at the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and I had a great boss who said, get out, because we have nothing for you here. I tried to get a job there, it didn't work. So I went to this job interview, which was for AIDS Action Now's Treatment Information Exchange. And the morning of the interview, I have a mole here, and I sliced it off when I was shaving. So I walked into the interview with Kleenex on here, and I got all prissied up with the best clothes that I had and a little binder, and went to the interview. And George was one of the people at the interview. There was a steering committee of people from AIDS Action Now. And I was instantly disliked by Mary Louise Adam, who I mentioned earlier. But George liked me for some reason. I think because I had a master's degree in sociology at that point. In any case, I was successful and got the job. And then worked with George for 4 or 5 years in an intensive period of mentorship by him prior to his death in 1994 of complications related to AIDS. And first in the Treatment Information Exchange, where I was able to sort of see his thinking, how he thought organizationally, how he was able to imagine what we were trying to create through this Treatment Information Exchange, not as a service for people, which this was the beginning of the creation of AIDS service organizations, which oriented to people living with HIV as clients. And he was very opposed to that and understood what we were doing as an intervention in the management of treatment for HIV. So it was interesting for me to see that. And then I burnt out after a couple of years, and he invited me to participate in an institutional ethnography focused on the social organization of access to social services for people living with HIV. And I said, yeah, I would do it, but I said, you have to let me be the co-principal investigator, right? Like, I knew enough about research that you had to be the co-principal investigator, which is kind of, a bit presumptuous of me. And he said, yeah, okay, that's fine, but you have to agree to one thing. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever. And he said, you must not, I'm not sure exactly how he said it, you must not destabilize the method that we're going to be using. We are using institutional ethnography, and you must commit to that wholeheartedly. And I was like, okay, whatever, like la-di-da. Yes, I will do that. And so then I had this fantastic opportunity to work with them over a two-year period where I think we met almost every day for that period of time. We did over 100 interviews. And it was fantastic because he never once treated me as less than, never. And I didn't know really what I was doing. I was the community person on this community-based research grant. And he led it intellectually, but once we started, it was never once did he treat me like the research assistant. It was always like a kind of balanced invitation from him to participate in creating knowledge about this issue. So that's how I knew him. And sorry, that's maybe a bit too long. And then so after having those experiences with him encouraged me to return to the university, because I had done basically just scraped through a master's degree, and would never have thought of going back to the university. But that experience of working with him really encouraged me. So I decided to apply to university, which I did, and then this tape, excuse me, because we used to tape everything back then. Like Dorothy used to tape almost every interaction she had, it seemed, right? Not entirely, but a lot of things were taped. And they had this practice of taping their lectures, taping their meetings. So this was a meeting that I had with George where I was asking him about what I should do my PhD on, right? And we had been talking about the idea of standards of care. And the tape that you're going to hear the snippets from illustrate part of a conversation where we are trying to understand what is it? What are standards of care? And what I found interesting going back to listening to this, and maybe you can talk about this, is the confusion we have that we're trying to sort out in this conversation, and the way in which George speaks from a ground of experience that is political as a way to formulate a research problematic that would explore standards of care as a social organization of knowledge. That, I think, is extraordinary. And we can't show you the whole thing because it's too long, but there are a few snippets. But maybe you can speak about sort of how you understand the dialogue as well.
Yeah, I mean, so the tape's about an hour long, and it is that work of like two people trying to figure out the very first steps of like, what is this? And I know a lot of us in this room have probably had this experience with a supervisor or a colleague where you kind of have a broad sense of what we want this research to do and the sort of political commitments that it's putting forward. But it's really about Eric and George Smith like trying to figure out like, what are we talking about here? And when I listened to it the first time, I was like, oh, these two are so smart. I have no idea what they're talking about. This is so above me. And then I was meeting up with Eric yesterday, and he was going, "What the heck were we talking about?" Like, it's so it wasn't just me, which was good. But there is like you can definitely see like the thinking of social organization at play here. So maybe I'll just play the first clip. So this is like at the very beginning of the tape. So far, all that's happened is Eric's just sort of told George what the project is going to be in broad strokes, and that's kind of where we pick up the conversation.
As a piece of study in social organization and knowledge, sort of how we conceptualize it. Okay, because essentially, the standard of care is a kind of knowledge.
Yeah, that's fine. This one.
This number's showing?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there it is. And so that's how I would think about this, the standard of care thing. And it also is, like a lot of things in social organization knowledge, is an issue of politics. It's a political power. It's not only the kind of power that doctors wield over patients, but it's also the kind of power that the hierarchy within the medical profession wield over one another, and consultants wield over primary care physicians and so on. And so
one of the things I'm interested to know about is how for you this issue came to be an important one.
It becomes a politically important issue because of the ways in which it comes out of the politics of treatment for people with AIDS.
So when along the course of your activism and your work did you start to see this and how
At the very beginning, almost.
So tell me about that.
It's like what kind of treatment can you get? Okay, and in AIDS, the treatment is like an experimental treatment of what people, particularly if you think about like 1970, 87, when people were talking about dextransol things and the L721 and on and on and on. There was concern that people weren't trying any treatments. Doctors.
The doctors were.
That's right. The doctors were completely out of it. Now, there are some exceptions to that, okay? In this city, for example, there were people like Mykhalovskiy and Dennis Conway who were part of the infection, Wayne and so on, who saw that there was nothing being done in terms of standards of care and what people should be doing. I remember having a conversation with Wayne about how to describe this. He worked in emergency wards and so on. Mm-hmm. And so he had known that there were documents that were used in medical emergency wards to do things that people might not know very much about, when you're just on there as a resident. And so he had talked a lot about the fact that there was nothing for treating people with AIDS. There were no standards of care, there were no procedures.
So there was nothing for him as a physician, what text for him to consult?
Yes, I always thought of these things as like little brochures or something and in fact, it was then talked about later as something that would come up on a computer monitor if you had access to it. An algorithm about what you would do first, second, third, what decision procedures you would take,
right.
All that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So there was
Yeah.
Do you want to keep going?
Pardon me?
Do you want to keep going?
No, we can talk a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this discussion sort of that you heard a snippet of, it's interesting because this is 1993. And so he's talking about, when he's talking about brochures, those are now called clinical practice guidelines, right? He was speaking before the concept of evidence-based medicine had really taken off in a significant way. And throughout the conversation, he continually speaks from his experience about how he has come to know about something called standards of care through conversations with doctors, through meetings that he's attended with other folks, and starts to piece together like a partial knowledge, and always treating it as a question, as a kind of uncertainty, like what is this, and how could we come to understand what standards of care are and how they're coordinated, how they coordinate sort of practice and what patients receive, how they intervene in doctor-patient relationships, as he's indicated in that little snippet, but also how they are shaped by pharmaceutical practices, by government regulation, and so forth. He starts to lay out this institutional terrain in this conversation in a really compelling and interesting way, always grounded from his experience. So it's an excellent example of thinking organizationally, producing a problematic for IE in ways that are about, how is the world put together? That, like, he was extraordinarily committed to institutional ethnography as a way of thinking, as a form of reliable knowledge for social movements. He had extraordinary confidence in its ability to guide people's political work. And what really struck me in my understanding of him and his work is how he emphasized that institutional ethnography was about trying to understand how the world was put together by people in their activities, in their actual activities, so that you could investigate these things and learn what was going on and then change them. And sometimes I think that's lost in the way IE is represented, understood, or practiced in scholarly environments. So it's nice for me to try to return to the ground that he emphasized always in his political and scholarly work.
Yeah, I think something that's interesting listening to the whole tape too is like it's clear as you're both trying to figure out this idea of clinical practice guidelines that for a lot of the tape you're not talking about the same thing. Like you kind of keep coming up against each other and like sort of figuring that out in real time. But the method itself is so solid and consistent, and you both keep coming back to like how will this actually inform what AIDS Action Now has done up to this point, and like how does this produce sort of like a now what for the action that's ongoing, which is really powerful to see. Yeah.
And then, you know what, and there's a second clip which we won't need to show you, or we might if we have time at the end, where he talks about, I read this newspaper article, and there's this dude up in Sudbury who says that, you shouldn't do, cesarean sections. Yeah. Cesarean sections, no, not so good. And then he said that they reported on these wide variations in practice. It was that the standard of care is in Sudbury is this because there's a really prominent physician there who doesn't think that cesarean sections are necessary, and so it's changed what's going on there. Or like it's being produced by people. Like the standard of care is emerging out of what goes on, and here's how it works, right? And the standard of care at this other place is different. The rates of cesarean section are 3 times as high in this other place. And I didn't remember this, but that's what I did my PhD on, precisely that topic, right? And it started in this conversation with George, which I had forgotten about.
Right.
Yeah,
so cool.
It's so great to go back to this.
I mean, since then, your work has been like situated within this lineage of activist institutional ethnography that has been directed at ending HIV criminalization. And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about how you understand the lineage from these very early conversations to like what your career became, which was this particular approach to activist IE.
Wow, I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. Can you say that again?
Sure.
That wasn't one of the questions we know.
It's that classic gotcha question that we didn't see coming. Just sort of, your work has always been about this activist-informed IE, and there's traces of it here in the tape.
Yeah.
And sort of how do you situate the work that you did after that, particularly around HIV criminalization, to be in conversation with this early dialogue with George?
Okay, well, I think maybe one thing was that, one of the things that George emphasized that stayed with me was that he was very practical about the university. And he was like, he encouraged me to go back to get my PhD, but only because he thought it would be useful politically. Really. He said, go back and do your PhD because it will give you a measure of authority that you will not otherwise have. Because he didn't have a PhD. He had written like more than one PhD. He'd written a dissertation on Charles Peirce, I believe, the philosopher, Charles Peirce. And then he had written, I believe his second dissertation he wrote was on labor standards and job classification in, I think, the plastics industry. And he didn't defend either one. I'm not entirely sure why. He was extraordinarily particular about his writing, and I don't think he was quite pleased with either one entirely. So it didn't. And so he had this like sense of not having a PhD that perhaps limited his career in some respects, because he was a research associate at OISE, but not a professor. So he's very much encouraged me to do that. But he said, like, just go back because it'll give you. Use it. Go back, get your PhD, and then use it politically. Yeah, that's what you should do. And then that stuck with me. I have tried in different ways to do that. Not always through IE, but often through some sort of way of thinking about the social organization of knowledge. Yeah.
And the tape, he calls it, he encourages Eric to get a PhD so that he'll be credentialed, like sees it in that kind of way. Yeah.
But what about you? Like, how do you see that lineage coming through in terms of your work?
Yeah, so I mean, I first came to know Eric's work through an article, a chapter in an edit collection that you wrote with Catherine Church called of T-shirts and Ontologies, where they're like reflecting on what it was like to know George and his work. And that really spoke to me as a grad student who was trying to figure out ways to put research to work for people, for movements. And so, yeah, I've just been very fortunate to be able to like learn from this model as it's developed, I think.
Yeah, you know, there was another T-shirt he used to wear too. I'm pretty sure. Like he would wear that T-shirt. I've made the ontological shift. He would wear it around OISE all the time, because he wanted people to ask him what it meant, because he was really interested in like encouraging people to take up Smith's work. But he also, I'm pretty sure, he had this T-shirt that was "I'm a friend of Dorothy's," which was partly about being a friend of Dorothy Smith, but also being a friend of what's the actress's name? Judy Garland, right? Which is the code way that gay men of a certain age would identify themselves to one another. Anyway, so yeah. But like the way he formulates the political significance of institutional ethnography is that it studies ruling relations that social movements are trying to confront, right? And here's how it works. Here are the problems. Here's like, let's produce a project that addresses, in some respects, some of the problems maybe that a social movement is trying to confront. And institutional ethnography can assist by making clear what's not fully visible. And so we saw an example of that yesterday when Alex and Vivienne were talking about funding relations, which are kind of opaque. Like, how does it come to be that they have these wonky, crazy categories? How have they designed this funding process that basically seems to, at every turn, discourage precisely what it's meant to encourage, right? And so they've started to try to uncover that and make it visible, because it's obvious, it's not clear. That's the premise, right? And that doesn't always happen though. No. There's a lot of time the activists are fully, quite clear that they know they know the relations of ruling already, right? So it's like, IE is not offering a form of knowledge necessarily in all instances that people are not fully that are not visible to them, but it means that you can relate with those folks and participate in the activism in a completely different way than other scholars might, I think.
Yeah, I was really struck yesterday by Naomi and Mitch's keynote as well, where this discussion around accountability came up quite clearly about how do we understand notions of accountability in relation to movements in particular. And I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. Afterwards, Mitch helped me understand that sort of the language of accountability is from a particular sort of feminist adult ed literature that uses that type of language. But I think I've always thought about it more in terms of relevance. How do we produce research in such a way that it can be taken up and used? And I think then that becomes a little bit of a different conversation. I think maybe saying the same things broadly politically, but is saying something a little bit differently because it's either used or it isn't, right? It's either relevant to them or it's not. And I think interesting to see, how what George is proposing in these tapes is like the exact opposite of what Alex and Vivienne described yesterday in terms of like it's obvious that those projects, some are more relevant than others to the communities that they claim to speak for. Yeah. And so I think it introduces particular ways of thinking about the relationship between research and action.
Yeah, you know, but it does set up problems of like a service relation between the academy and social movements, which can be difficult. There are issues of autonomy, scholarly autonomy, that might be raised that he didn't care about. Not that he didn't care about. He didn't write about that. But when you say also that it opens the door to thinking more broadly about what kind of knowledge is useful, like, and I think about HIV criminalization in terms of some of the early years, like some of the most important research knowledge wasn't institutional ethnographic. Like the stuff about, you know, who is being charged and the demographics of that to show the inequities in the way the criminal justice system was working, like that was not really institutional ethnography, but the insight that knowledge was needed and that it could ground a form of discourse that was required for activists to make certain type of claims came from, I think, an understanding of the social organization of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, it was relevant to the action or the argument they're trying to make in that moment.
Yeah.
You want to talk about now?
I don't know. Social movements?
Yeah. Maybe you could speak a little bit about, you know, what makes IE's approach to social movements different from other sociologies that you see students wanting to take on or that are widely read. What sort of distinguishes it from other approaches?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and like I wouldn't want to say that like there are many ways for scholars to be engaged with social movements, right? Like, and they all have benefits and can be doing good things, and so it's not about like, oh, IE is the only way to connect with social movements in a meaningful way. I'm not interested in suggesting that, but I do think it's still relevant to make a distinction between the study of social movements, the sociological study of social movements, where the movement is treated as the object of inquiry, right? And scholars of social movements, like, and I don't want to be too overgeneralized, but they're concerned with like, how do you conceptualize the movement, right? What form of social change do movements produce? How do we conceptualize movements as a form of collective action? What is their role in historical transformation? Like those are sociological questions that treat the movement as an object of reflection, and people who do that work may often be involved with the social movement that they're investigating and participate, and it's great. That's all fine. But that's not what IE formulates as a connection to social movements, because the concern is to, I think, depends, but it's to explore as I suggested earlier, to explore the relations of ruling that movements are confronting in such a way that can be politically useful by showing here's how it works, here's how it can be changed. And so there is a kind of like reformist character to some of that, which I think some people may not be pleased with. It's like not a revolutionary kind of approach, I don't think. You know, like Alan Pence used to call it sort of institutional tinkering, which I think is like, and she did that with kind of like one of her wry smiles. Like it was like kind of like an undersell, right? But there is a kind of thing about like, how do you understand what institutional ethnography produces in relation to some of the more sort of utopian sort of politics that are put forward. And like in the particular historical moment that we face now where, wow, what do we need? Do we need small institutional transformations, or are the more sort of like revolutionary gestures of social change more appealing these days? I'm not sure how to answer that. And I'm not sure how to think about institutional ethnography in relation to those kind of debates. But that would be something interesting for people to consider, I think.
Yeah, maybe, Colin, there's a slide that I was hoping to show. One more. There we go. Eric, not to put this question right back to you, but we can talk about this together as a group. In 2018, you wrote that creating a vibrant future for political activist ethnography will require its practitioners to face the crisis that has taken hold in universities and to refuse, resist, challenge, and change the direction of transformation. So you wrote this in 2018, so two-parter. First, did you think it would get this bad? And second, what does it look like for us to try to refuse, resist, and challenge in this moment?
I don't remember that entirely. Like, I thought it was something else.
Oh.
I thought that was from a different piece of writing. But
We can talk about that one too.
Well, that was written in 2006, right? And it was sort of similar. And it wasn't copying myself, I was promised. It wasn't plagiarizing. But I think the earlier piece that I thought that was taken from was more concerned with the kind of relations of funding that we heard about yesterday, where research within universities was being constrained in very narrowly applied directions, orienting to research partners as clients of the research that was being produced, that promoted a kind of managerialism in research because of an emphasis placed on large projects that were multidisciplinary, and so scholars were becoming managers of other people's labor. Those kind of relations were the things that I thought that was coming from, but that's not what that is. And so at that point, I certainly didn't envision what we are facing now. Here, I remember where that's from, and I think I was referring to much broader challenges of environmental degradation, species problems, xenophobia, rampant and ongoing racism at multiple levels, but not the collapse of like liberal democracy yet, right? I didn't think about that when I wrote that, and nor did I sort of consider, even then, the type of challenges that are being faced within universities, within Canada and more broadly, where the fight is much starker, where universities are being not being gutted, where there is a project of, at least let's make it simpler, in Canada, where the university sector across the country is being rapidly restructured through a private corporate models of change that are based in contract relationships that universities create with private consulting firms. Particularly the Nous group from Australia, I think it's Australia or New Zealand, I can't remember, where there's a template of change that is being produced and generalized across the sector, where smaller programs are being amalgamated into larger units, where there's an assault on collegial governance that's very stark, where there's a sort of a business model of the university produced in part by changes in Board of Governors, where Board of Governors are taking over, not taking over, but are leading the show in ways that were historically not the case. So those types of challenges that really threaten the premises of the university weren't anticipated.
Well, yeah, and it's not only the premises of the university, it's often when we have these restructuring models, whether or not it's like the conspiracy reason behind them and programs are getting amalgamated, it is those ones where critical thinking happens, right? It is the critical social sciences and the humanities that are getting smaller and have less say in how the institution is run. And so, yeah, it's a frightening time.
Yeah, I think it's much more difficult, particularly when it's also happening in the context of these sort of global transformations that are very difficult to recognize how one can intervene in, right? And I think a lot of people have struggled just to listen to it all, to witness. Even witnessing the changes is hard enough, and trying to think about how to participate in transformation is much more difficult when the scale of changes is so broad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Do we want to open it up to the
group?
Yeah, any questions, reflections, points to share, Naomi?
Just as on this point of tinkering and transformation, sorry, Colin. Although I feel like I should touch it. Messy. I recently wrote a grant because I was feeling that same inclination in institutional ethnography, like sort of do this like modest, one little gain in policy or these tiny little shifts. But then in the last 6 months, or 2 months, even 3 months, I've seen that massive transformation is really dangerous and feels absolutely irresponsible. And so I'm thinking differently about institutions and the stabilizing role they play, and that maybe there's some safety in the slowness that it takes to move them, and maybe not. Maybe I'm just getting old, and so I want to hold on to what I know, but yeah, I just wondered if you two had thought about that also in relation to that question of like institutional tinkering versus institutional transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they necessarily have to happen in isolation from each other, right? Like the movements are broad and requires a diversity of tactics, absolutely. I think something with the pace is something we've been talking about a little bit, about the type of work that George is describing is like a very slow type of scholarship. And more in the neoliberalization of the institutions, like our work is quantified and counted and measured, and that's the basis upon which the assessment of our work happens. And so there's like this gulf between the type of work that is required, that is slow, that is not like rapid reviews necessarily, or these multiple high impact publications every year. It is like a slower, more patient, maybe more deliberate type of analysis of what's happening here. But the institution doesn't necessarily allow that type of work where more and more it's about the quantification, metricization of this work.
Yeah, institutional ethnography is a research practice. It's not a political strategy. In of itself, it's not. And so it produces knowledge about relations of ruling, and the transformation of those rulings is, in some respects, not entirely, but is disconnected from the production of the knowledge. It doesn't have to be, but George produces this idea of science, of i.e. as science, and I'm going to do the analysis, and you can go and do what you want with it, which was not entirely what he did in his own life. It's a bit weird. I think that was pressures from the journal about how to, and I remember I don't have it anymore, but he wrote an extraordinarily long response to the editors when that article was being reviewed about all the things he was not going to change and the reasons why. But I think he did sort of produce a version of IE as science because he wanted to build its credibility and so forth. But when I think about HIV criminalization, a lot of we talked a little bit about this the other day, where researchers are, they're kind of invited to inflate their importance, right? That this research is going to matter somehow. It's like, well, yeah, really? Do you need research to make these, do we need another study of the social determinants of health? For God's sakes, we know that the social determinants of health are the primary determinants of health at a population level. We know that education, housing, income, we've known that for decades. And people continue to, and maybe they need to continue to do the research because it's so unstable politically. But you don't need it to demonstrate that this is what you need to do. What needs to be done is apart from the research. It's a set of other relations of transformation that the research can perhaps influence, but it's not determinative, right? And I think of the HIV criminalization field, where one of the really interesting things about that field in Canada is that it's primarily being shaped by institutional ethnography. People wouldn't necessarily know that, right? But early on, we realized that a knowledge base needed to be created to support activists' work against HIV criminalization. And it's been taken forward in different ways by different people. There's a little bit of the descriptive statistics that have been produced, and that has filled up a certain kind of function politically. There's the work that's been done on public health implications of criminalization, which provided a set of arguments that could be used about the harms that criminalization produces. And that work was also institutional ethnography. It was exploring ruling relations of public health and how nurses were being affected by criminal laws and so forth, public health nurses. And then there's work that Alex has been doing around sort of incarceration and the direct harms of criminalization on the lives of people living with HIV. And all that stuff you could trace the connections over whose work has gone through, influenced whom. And there's students of mine, students of Vivienne's. It's created this base of knowledge, and that knowledge collectively has moved the needle like this. Here, a little bit, not even a little bit, a bit, maybe. It was part of the party. My sense is that if we didn't have the transformations in the biomedical science, and the developments that have meant that people living with HIV who are virally suppressed don't transmit HIV. If that wasn't happening, we would be back in the same space that we were 20 years ago, right? But this social science research, as a collective, has, I think, played a role in, not revolutionarily transforming the criminal justice system, but slowly, helping to change views, to shift discourse, to enter into debates and so forth in ways that I think have had a positive kind of effect. But it's not, that's 20 years of work, right? And so the slow scholarship, but can you think of what are you doing? How do you imagine your career? How do you imagine what's possible? How do you avoid the kind of hubris that's my research is so important, it's going to change the world? It's go fuck yourself, right? Because it's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. What is a responsible relationship to claims about your own knowledge that you're creating? And what does that look like for institutional ethnography? I'm comfortable with the idea that it can participate, it can contribute to a certain scale of transformation. But I don't think I'm comfortable with something beyond that, because I just don't think that's what happens.
Thank you to both of you and to Bernie, for George's voice literally in the room. So I've been thinking a lot about teams because of and how research work together. I think that fits in with legacy and mentorship, but I've been thinking about it in conversation to what Alex and Vivienne talked about yesterday, and how the tri councils are oh, you need to work in this year's team. So I'm just wondering if you can talk more, both of you, about the approach that some IE researchers do in sort of working collaboration with other IE researchers, with other with organizations, with movements, that piece and how that might be different and important or not.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would want to think more about that, but the first thing that comes to mind is there's often the person who's brought onto a team to do the IE piece, right? And the way that is or is not aligned with the overall ontological slant of the project. And so what it means to sort of insert work in that kind of way is important to consider. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
I think there was a question about how did working with George restore your faith in sociology? And because I was really not interested in sociology after my master's degree. I thought it was kind of useless. And one of the things, and I was talking with Carol Ann O'Brien about this a few years ago. We were walking through the ravine, and we were both getting older and kind of feeling a little alone. And we're yeah, we'd like to be a part of something. I like to be a part of something. And we both appreciated being involved in certain social movements because it was a form of collaboration that we like to belong, right? And not in a kind of pathetic way, where I need to be I'm a lemming that needs to be led, right? And there's some challenges there around IE and the kind of yeah, IE, to do it, this is the one way, you got to do it this way, right? There's some of that, there's a fair bit of that, which, it's complicated to sort of navigate that. But, you talk about teams, one of the reasons that it worked for me is that I could participate in something that was shared by other people in a way that was not okay, I want to do political economy. Yeah, okay, but it wasn't the same as the community that had formed around institutional ethnography that produced possibilities for connection and belonging, because it was not just a political orientation or not just a form of Marxism, which you could say that it is, but it was because it's a way of creating knowledge that was shared, and so that you could connect with people who may be working in other empirical areas because the kind of knowledge they were producing was similar. And it created, for me, a way of belonging to something that enriched my life. It has enriched my life. It would have been hard for me to be a solo academic, that ivory, that metaphor of the person sitting in the ivory tower doing their own work on their own all the time by themselves, reading the book. I would have lasted a year, and I would have that's it. It's too independent. So it's not a kind of team that you're sort of perhaps imagining, which is an artifact of funding, right? Like these teams are produced because of funding relations. I don't think they're produced for much other reasons other than that. But I think I haven't participated in a research team that's about only IE researchers. I've never done that. Not sure what that would look like. And I certainly don't appreciate at all the kinds of expectations to work collaboratively that are built into contemporary funding relations, because they're not actually about sharing. They're not actually about working in a way that's jiving and creating something new. It's about producing what's expected and required of the funding application by demonstrating you're a part of, by getting all the CVs and clicking off the multidisciplinary boxes and so forth. Now, you can work within those parameters to try to create something. And I have to, this is being taped, right? I have to say, with no particular disrespect to any PIs, that's never happened for me, I don't think, with some very few exceptions that I've participated. And so I started my career in a medical school, so I have a lot of history of CIHR funding and participating in this stuff. I've been on multiple large, multi-million-dollar team grants, CIHR funded, and I don't think any of them have produced anything that approximates the kind of what I think you might be thinking of in terms of real collaborations.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, we talked really fascinating. I want to bring back the Friends of Dorothy t-shirt for next year. I actually have one of those. I wanted to ask about this quote that George Smith did in the tape. Really awesome to hear his voice. Thank you for bringing that into the room. Where he said, from brochure to computer monitor, something about an algorithm. And I think this maybe question goes for both of you, but also for Colin, thinking about some of our work, like examining science and technology studies, and IE's relationship to technology and how knowledge circulates. Because there is this discussion about how understanding how the world is put together by people, but then how that putting together by people is also translated through technology. So I just wanted to ask about any reflections on that, because I thought that quote was really interesting.
Yeah, it's. I was really struck by that moment in the tape as well, when he's like, and some of it's even on like a computer screen, and like an algorithm that they follow. And I think it's very hard for institutional ethnographers to get to the work, like the person doing the work, when the texts are so like dispersed and broad and detached from the space that they orient to, right? Like in the tape, he's speaking about pamphlets, which is like a piece of paper you can hold on to, and like that came from somewhere. But to try to do an analysis of a public health surveillance technology that is on your phone, or thinking, Alex, about like our blood pathway work and the ways that the actual biomaterial itself changes form throughout a long process that traverses across the country. That's really difficult. And what I keep coming to is, I think you just keep going until you find a person, right? Like you have to speak to power eventually. There was a question yesterday about like what are you obsessed with, like in your research, and I'm the opposite of obsessed with this idea of objectivity. When I was doing research about news media production, like that's all reporters wanted to speak about was objectivity, and which is so boring, like, and not really what I'm interested in at all. And I find that in students, when I ask them to read something, when we have a discussion of an article, the sort of first thing they want to talk is destroy it because it's not objective research, right? And I think technology feeds into that sort of logic as well, that it's like, it's safer if we have more people having access to our public health records because it provides a more scientifically targeted type of intervention into HIV cases, for example, right? Alex and I have been doing some work about, and as part of a broader team, about public health surveillance and public health interventions. And one of the things we've heard in interviews from public health nurses is like having a greater technological access to people's health records actually allows them to surveil less or to be like less interventionist, which is that sort of objectivity logic, I think, sort of creeping in as well. So this is sort of a long-winded way of saying, I think objectivity is only useful if the people that you're talking about are the people in power. And I think keeping the analysis on the powerful and using the tools of IE as part of a broader effort to hold people to account and to make their work visible to people so that it can be transformed and resisted is really important. And so I think we just really need to hold on to that as part of an IE approach.
Yeah. I interpret your remarks as calling into question the ontology of the social that IE relies upon, which is profoundly anthropocentric, right? And I don't think that's terrible, but I think that it needs to be sort of rethought slightly in ways that attend to the current sort of crises of the world, which have to do with the planet and other species and their relationships with human beings. And so the ontology needs to shift in such a way that doesn't displace the human subject, I don't think, which might be what the flat ontology of ANT might recommend. And I'm not interested in that. But that needs to somehow take into account that, we human beings play a particular role in coordinating activities in the world, but not outside of relationships with other species, with non-human actors. The texts play a role in IE as not actants in an ANT way, but as a kind of like thing that's there, that does stuff. But I think it is important for people moving forward to become conversant with, or not conversant with, but to consider questions about posthumanism and ontologies, a relational thought that, coming from indigenous perspectives and elsewhere, that offer something slightly different and that challenge, I think, the anthropocentric ontology of IE. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just one more point, and I think, Alex, we've spoken about this a little bit as well, but I think IE also assumes a level of transparency, that you can see it at some point, and that you are interfacing with the ruling relations, that they can kind of see you as well. And that disappears behind the broad digitization of these types of ruling practices. Oh, sorry, hey.
Question. As you're speaking about relationships, among humans and beyond humans, and teams and connectedness, I'm wondering if an ethic of care is a useful tool or a useful lens within IE.
Yeah.
What is an ethic of care? Depends on what an ethic of care is. I'm not sure that's a singular thing. So what did you have in mind?
Looking at the world through how people are connected, looking at the world in terms of interdependencies, how everybody is, all of us and beyond humans are dependent on each other, looking at reciprocity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it sounds great. Yep.
Okay. Easy answer.
Very good.
Dr. There was something you said about greater technological advancements made surveillance kind of increase the possibility of surveillance. I'm really interested in that because that super jumped out at me.
I just want to say directly into the camera, that's not something that I said. I'm paraphrasing. Let's not attribute that to. Yeah. So, and maybe Alex can support me with this as well, but in some of the interviews we're doing with people who work in public health, we're trying to get a sense of how do you intervene in the life of somebody living with HIV in a way that is like heavy-handed, is punitive, right? Eric and I have done some work looking at public health case management texts, like that guide the work of public health practitioners. Working on a team with Alex that's trying to interview people about their work practices. And one of the logics that we've been really kind of surprised by, in the way that it sounds like you are as well, is the rationalization for the removal of guardrails or barriers that would block someone having access to one's health record, is saying, well, if we know more about the person and their behaviors and their attachment to healthcare, their treatment regimen, then we can make sharper, more pinpointed interventions into their lives. We will know more about when to engage into somebody's life in ways that are sort of not consensual. And that's a logic that I think we would want to be concerned about. It's not like an either-or situation, right? We can respect privacy and autonomy and also have really stringent guidelines about when these interventions happen and to whom.
Are there any other questions in the room? Yes.
I wanted to ask Eric about this idea of credentializing for political purposes, about this, I think, the way he was talking about, which I identify with, and I just wanted to ask you a bit about that. And I think you also said in passing that IE itself isn't inherently political. It's just the method. But then George Smith talks about a grounded political organization from which to ask questions. And I just wanted to ask you the relationship. Well, I guess just a little bit more to talk about that engagement with the academia for political purposes, but also this relationship that IE isn't just a method that sits there, that's static.
That's not what I said.
Okay. So yeah, so I just wanted to ask more about that.
I dropped my voice an octave to make that point more forcefully, that I didn't say that it's just a method, because it's not just a method. I said it's not a political strategy, which I don't think it is. It's not that it's not political, but it doesn't formulate an activist strategy for anyone. That is independent work, right? Which can be connected. And I think part of the thing that's been useful for me is that the best part of it is that institutional ethnography I've been able to be what I would call an embedded scholar, in the sense that I can work within a social movement, be part of that social movement, but also do my intellectual work. Without studying the movement, because I'm not interested in, people don't need to be studied. It's fine. Knock yourself out, that's interesting, it's important. But that's not what I want to do, and it's not what the people that I work with are interested in. There's what can you, and it's not even what can you do for us, because I'm part of the us. And that's what I like. I like that collapsing, which George does not talk about. He wants to preserve in that article a separation because he wants to build the credibility of institutional ethnography as a research practice for social problems, which was a prominent journal, American journal, and still is. So yeah, that's I think what I was trying to get at. The credentialing, it's a bit of a cynical way to view one's participation in the academy. And I don't think that he would have embraced that kind of perspective. But what he wanted to emphasize was the practical dimensions of a degree. Not that you shouldn't learn and develop your craft and think and learn from the work of others and develop a relationship to philosophy or whatever it is that you're studying. I think he was very much into that himself, right? Very much. But he was a no-nonsense person, right? He was as formidable as Dorothy Smith was in his persona. And he was very intimidating. Not very intimidating, he's a very kind person. But he didn't suffer fools. And he was you want to go to university, you can do, I think he was encouraged by people's promise and wanted people to do stuff. Right? And it's here, look what, you get this PhD, you can then do this and this and this. You can have an influence that you would not otherwise have. Recognize that and understand that and work with that, right?
Can I have a stay on the same thing that Alex was talking about a little bit? Just because I do actually think there is maybe something that is inherently political, but it's institutional photography. Not the way we do it as sociologists, but the dispositional sort of way of viewing the world that is strategic, figure out how it works. Like, as a stance, I think it, not as a method, it is political, for me anyway, like as a starting place for, yeah.
I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying it's not a political strategy. It doesn't in of itself tell you, it doesn't direct how activists are going to engage with the knowledge and how they will use it politically, strategically. Like, that is a piece of work that's independent of the knowledge that IE produces, because it's not a study of strategy. It's not me studying social movement saying, okay, you know, your police raid approach didn't work, so why don't you try this way of doing a demo? It's not that. It's like, here are the ruling relations and how they operate. And generally, people who produce the knowledge have a political commitment to the transformation that they are, you know, suggesting. But that's, you know, it is important also to have a distinction, right? I've just said I love the blurring of the boundaries, but it's also important to have a distinction, right, as well. And I'm not, like, you know, like, like, the work that Liza McCoy has done on photographic texts, it's not political in the way that you're talking about. The work that's been done on, you know, orchestral scores, it's not political in the way you're talking about. So, like, is it intrinsically political? And that would seem to suggest that every piece of IE has to have a certain political character. I think that's a mistake to suggest that. I think it often does, but it doesn't have to be that way. Like, there can be IE projects that are conceptualized in such a way that they're not intimately tied to a particular sort of understanding of the critique. Although you read Dorothy and it's like the politics is constitutive of IE, right? Like, it's in that introduction to writing the social, right? So, like, I'm not trying to say, you know, I'm trying to, like, you know, question a little bit and create a space for a variety of ways of thinking about what IE is, not undermine a sense that it is a political project, or can be, or often is, but also it suggests that it's not formulating a political strategy. That's not the same thing as saying it's not political. Yeah.
I appreciate that distinction.
You made his voice drop again, Naomi.
And you don't, yeah.
Funny, because I was going to ask, like, you said something that was very, very interesting about how IE assumes you can see these texts and that the digital world does not enable that. And then I'm thinking about the problem with, you know, case management, whether it's from a social work perspective or whether it's from a medical perspective, that these case notes are being digitally recorded and affect the relations of treatment on individuals, and how IE can expose that. But then there's the question of access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think access is always going to be a challenge, right? And I think it is. I mean, one of the best lessons that I got from Eric was, like, that it's all data. Like, even efforts to access things that we want to see, that we bump in against and we don't get, like, that is, you learn something about the nature of the ruling relations by what you're able to see and what you're not. Even though it's not a sort of straightforward thing that files nicely into a chapter or something, the sort of bumps and stops and starts, those are all really valuable knowledge about how the system works for some people over others. Sorry, we're at time. No.
Like, I think this as access question is really important, because if you look at the body of work that's been produced within IE, although varied, there's also kind of like lumps together around things that are easy to do, right? There's all this work about professional practice, right? Because that's easy to get at, but there's very little work on capital, right? There's very little work on science, I think. So how you reach into the corridors of power, if we can use that metaphor, is very challenging. And you know, IE places a premium on empirical discovery and investigation. And so if you can't, and it makes the claim that the world is investigable, right? And doesn't pay a lot of attention to the real serious barriers that exist in trying to reach into certain spheres of the ruling relations that the IE has ignored or hasn't studied. And the biggest one is like capital. You know, like, which is nice, but that your work is, you know, going to reach into that. You know, like the formation of markets. There's other scholars working in other traditions of social science that are working on markets. IE has done very little to explore the organization of market relations, which are fundamental to contemporary capitalism. It's worked at professional practice, right? That's been the primary site of research for IE. Social work, education, healthcare, what are these healthcare professionals screwing people over, how are they doing it, that kind of thing, right? But not much beyond that, I don't think. I could be wrong, and field is beyond what anyone can know. There's so much work being done now, and there is stuff that obviously tons of stuff that I don't know about, but that's my sense of the main contours. And it raises, I think, part of that, like if you thought organizationally about the production of IE research, like what are the relations that shape IE research itself? One of the problems is that it's very difficult to access certain relations of ruling. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, just to wrap up, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing that tape. I know this was obviously not the context that you originally thought it would be shared in or shared at all. So that was really generous, and wanted to say thank you. I thought it was, you know, Eric and I were so pleased to get this invitation from Naomi, and originally we were thinking like, maybe we push back against this idea of like intergenerations. Like Eric and I, you know, I'm lucky that we get to work together still, and like we're working on the same contemporary issues. Maybe we're not different generations really. And then the call ended by Eric saying, so I have a cassette tape, but I don't know, I don't quite know how to play it. And so we were thinking, okay, maybe there is like a generational slant to this. But thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you.
Can we please give a big round of applause for Colin?